Welcome back to Adobe Lightroom Classic, and today we're going to take a look at the Develop module. So when you are editing inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic, or really any photo editing program, you're making two basic types of adjustments. You're going to be making global adjustments, so an adjustment that affects the whole image, and then you're going to be making what we call selective adjustments. And the selective adjustment is just going to adjust or affect a small portion of the image. Now, most adjustments that you end up making are going to be selective adjustments, not global adjustments. So today we're going to be taking a look at the basic Develop panel inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic. And what we're going to take a look at are profiles, white balance, which is probably the most important thing, and some basic global adjustments that we might be making. So let's slide on over here to Adobe Lightroom Classic. And so we have three images we're going to take a look at, and we're just click on this first image, and we're going to slide over here, and you can see right up on the top, we've got the little Develop module. We're going to select that, and it's going to reconfigure the way this is looking. Up here, we have our histogram, and I'm going to open that up. Now, the histogram has the shooting data as long as it has been embedded in your image. And that's really helpful when you're trying to learn photography or teach it, in my case, because I can see what students or people did, and it really gives me an idea of what you might have done right or wrong. But above that, what we have is the histogram. So if we look at the histogram, what the histogram shows is where the data is in your image. And depending on the image and the exposure, the histogram is going to look different. On the left-hand side over here are your shadows. The right-hand side are your highlights. And the midtones are basically here in the center. And if we click on these different images, you're going to see this shifts a little bit. So we've got, notice, more data over towards the shadow area. But if you look at this image, it's too dark. And if we come over here where this woman has a lot of black and it's dark, notice we don't have a lot of highlight data yet. We have most of our shadow data. And a lot of people think that this needs to be right in the center. That's not true. It depends on the image. If you have a lot of black, you're not going to have any data in the midtones and the highlights. Where your histogram is partly dependent on the exposure, your adjustments, and what's inside of the image. If you look up here, we have two little boxes. We have the shadow box, and over here we have one for the highlights. And if we select those by clicking them, there's a little white box. See the little white box? Over here, click that. Little white box shows up. What that does is enable what we call clipping. So clipping in the shadows, clipping in the highlights. And that means that if you make your shadows too dark, they're going to start clipping. You're going to lose that data information, which is not good. And if you brighten your highlights up too much where you start to lose data, that's not good. That's going to show clipping. So let me show you what that looks like. We'll just make a basic adjustment and we'll go too far. So you can see right here where it's going blue, it's showing that you're clipping and you've made this too dark. So let's come back up here to the exposure and let me see where this comes in. So this is not even showing clipping right here. And this is obviously way too dark. The clipping starts way before this. This is way too dark. I don't use this, but I guess it could be helpful in the beginning. So we'll do the same thing where we're starting to lose our highlights, and you could see up there it's saying, hey, you have now lost data. There's nothing there. You're at 0%. So we can slide this back here and get this close to 0. So that's what those little boxes on the top right and left-hand corners of the histogram do. They just show us clipping. Now, I don't really use the histogram when I'm adjusting images. I do use it in Adobe Photoshop, but I don't really rely on it that much inside of Lightroom because my monitor is calibrated and my eyes are pretty used to seeing what an exposure should look like. So we're going to go ahead and turn that off because I don't want those up there. The next thing that we have down below that is our main editing screen. So this little thing with the sliders is showing us this. So if we were to come over here and click on the masking icon, it would bring up this different set of adjustments. And if we want to go back to our basic settings, that's where this icon comes in. We click on this and it brings us back to where we started. Right here is our crop tool. This is our remove tool, also the clone stamp tool or the healing brush. We have one for red eye reduction, and this is for making selective adjustments, and this is the masking icon, which we won't be taking a look at today, but we will in the next video. Right here, we have our basic window and our inside of our basic window, and you can turn this on or off by just holding this on or off to show you what you did kind of before and after. But you'll notice we've got an auto button, a black and white button, and an HDR button. So HDR stands for high dynamic range, and it gives you a simulation of what high dynamic range will look like. However, you have to have a monitor that has enough resolution that it can actually show you what that high dynamic range looks like. Auto is really simple. You click this and it will auto tone how it thinks. All right. Now, I have found that in general, auto tone is not beneficial. Essentially, what it's doing is setting white and setting black. Occasionally that works, but in a lot of images, it doesn't work. So what we're going to be showing you here is how to manually adjust these images. Clicking buttons like auto isn't going to teach you how to use the program. I'm just going to slide down here to the bottom where it says reset. I'm going to click that and it's going to reset everything because we don't want to use it. If we wanted to turn it to a black and white, we click there for black and white. I will come down here once again, hit reset, and everything will be back to normal. So our next option right here under Profiles, you'll see I have loaded and I set this in the preferences to use the Adobe Color profiles. And if I click on those, you'll see we've got Adobe Color, Landscape, Portrait, Standard, Vivid, Monochrome, and Browse, okay? Now, what profiles do is just giving you a starting point. They control the color saturation and basically the contrast of the image. If you have a camera, a lot of cameras have profiles built into them with basically the same thing. They might have a portrait, a landscape, a vivid, a neutral color profile. And this is just giving you a look or a starting point. If we come back to our original image here and I go to Adobe Color, this is just kind of an in-between. It's going to have a pretty good color saturation and the contrast is going to be medium, let's say. But if we go to Landscape and we click that, what you'll see is the contrast is going to increase and the color saturation is going to be higher. If we go to the Portrait or Standard, it's going to flatten out your image and you're going to have less color saturation. And Adobe Vivid is going to give you the most contrast and color saturation. Monochrome is just going to give you black and white look. We don't want that. So most of the time I'm using either Adobe Color or Portrait or Standard. I will tell you, I cannot actually tell the difference between the Portrait and Standard. But for this image, we're just going to leave it on Adobe Color. Can come on over here, you'll see there's these little teeny boxes over here on the right hand side, and they don't really have any information. But if you click on it, what it will do is give you a bunch of presets. And you can scroll through these different presets and adjust them. For right now, we're not going to use those. So I'm going to hit close and we're going to leave those alone. And the reason we're not going to take a look at the presets because this tutorial is aimed at teaching you how to use the program, not clicking buttons. Presets are nothing special. They're just the same adjustments that you can make over here. It's just somebody has made them already and saved them. And the problem with presets are they don't work perfectly for every image. So even if you use a preset, you still have to know how to adjust it to get it to look right. All right, so the next thing that we have down here is the most important thing that you're always going to need to use, and it looks like Warner Brothers, but it's just a WB, and that stands for white balance. Right here, we have a little teeny white balance selector, and what this does is it's going to try to white balance or make a neutral gray. So if I come over here and I click in the sky, you can see it shift the color. If I click on it again, I come over here and select that. It's changing the white balance of the image. What it's trying to do, it's trying to make the red, the green, and the blue channels all the same number. So if we look up on the top right-hand side screen, it right now, and I can't move it or we won't see it, it's now 9.6, 9.6, 9.6, okay? Whenever all three, the red, the green, and the blue are exactly the same, that means you have a complete neutral gray. The problem with this is it's shot at sunset. It's not going to be a neutral gray, even though this is black because we have that warm color sun. I don't find white balance to be a very useful tool unless you're shooting in somewhere like a studio and you want that perfectly neutral color. So in this case, we're not going to use that. What we can do is come back down here, hit reset, and get back to where we were. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's something that says as shot. And so this is what your white balance was when you're shooting. Just for basic information, I leave mine on auto white balance. And the reason is because I shoot raw and I can do all this post-production. If we come over here and look at this, we've got as shot, auto, daylight, cloudy, shade, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, and custom. Custom will just appear whenever you slide any of these sliders. So by default, I think just clicking auto is your best bet. It tends to be a little bit warm, but in this image, it actually looks better than the as shot. And then we can go to daylight, shade, tungsten, fluorescent, flash. These are all presets. So do you want it to be a neutral color like this, or do you want it to be a warmer color like we saw here? So in this image, I can tell the sun is coming from this direction. It's shot as the sun is setting. We know that that is golden hour, and this is going to be a warmer colored image. You will notice over here, we have temperature and tint. Now, temperature is the one you're going to be using most of the time. And so the temperature slider is colored. One side is blue, one side is yellow. So if we slide towards the yellow, it's going to warm up our image. And if we go towards the left, it's going to cool our image. So once we've used this preset, in this case auto, if I want to further refine it, we can slide this slider. But when I do, notice the auto right here is going to change to custom. So I slid it a little bit, and there we go. It's now custom because I'm manually adjusting that. Below that, we have tint, and that if we go to the left, it's going to make it more green. And right, it's going to make it more magenta. And so if you've ever tried to slide these back, you will notice that trying to get it exactly at 0 can be difficult. So if you want to reset this back to 0, it's really simple. You just come over tint and you double left click and boom, just like that, it goes back to 0. If you want to reset the whole white balance panel, you hold the Option on a Mac, the Alt on a PC, and you'll notice that white balance turns into reset white balance, and you click. So right here, we could reset everything, but if we hold the Option keys in any of these items, we can reset just the category itself. So double left click on the word to reset it, the Option or Alt key to reset everything in it, and reset down here to reset all the different panels. In this image, we're going to go ahead and change this to auto, and we'll go ahead and slide this and make it a little bit warmer. Below that, we have the tone panel. And so the tone panel is going to give us adjustments on exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. Exposure is easy. It's going to make your image brighter or darker. Contrast, what contrast does is either going to make your blacks blacker and your whites whiter, or your blacks less black and your whites grayer. So if we go to the left, it's going to flatten out your image. If we go to the right, it's going to increase your image. And so that's what contrast does. Highlights is simple. It's making the highlights brighter, the highlights darker. Shadows, we are making your shadows brighter or darker. Whites makes your whites whiter or darker, and blacks makes your blacks brighter or darker, right? And that is everything inside of the tone panel. I'm going to hold that Option key and reset that so we get there. Now, what you do not want to do when you make a global adjustment is adjust it so one area looks better, but another area looks worse. So let's take a look at this image. So right here, you'll notice that we have just the highlight detail in this wedding dress. We do not want to make this perfectly white. That would be a bad thing. If we wanted to brighten up this area and I slid my exposure up, you'll notice it's starting to make this area too bright. So we don't want to make an adjustment where one area gets fixed and one area gets ruined. And remember, the reason for that is we can make what we call selective adjustments. Now, we're not tackling that today, but if you have an area, as you make an adjustment, it makes one area look good and another area look worse. Hold off. Don't make the adjustment because we can make it as a selective adjustment. So let's go ahead and double click that and reset it. So in this image, I can open up my shadows a little bit. And since I want to hold this highlight detail, I think we can pull down the highlights just a little bit. It's going to do the highlights everywhere, but we're getting a little bit more detail and we're getting further away from clipping that area, which is what we don't want. I tend to do this process, and you're going to hear me as I go through these tutorials because I'm making some basic adjustments basically inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic. And then normally I would send it to Adobe Photoshop where I refine everything. And I tend to tone a little bit flat in Lightroom because it makes it easier for me to adjust values. And then once I get into Photoshop and I'm finally done, I can add that pop of contrast into it. And so what happens is if you make your blacks really crunched like this, and now you want to brighten these up, you're going to have to make a stronger adjustment in this area to brighten it up. And it's more likely to fall apart than if you had it sort of at a normal value, where in this instance, where it's closer to where we started, it's going to be easier to brighten this up and you won't have to make as strong of adjustment and you're less likely to have it fall apart. So that's what I mean by toning flat in an image. So we're just starting out with the contrast a little bit lower than maybe we want. It's not going to give us that punch, but we can add that in the end. So if we come to this image right here, you'll notice this girl's skin color, everything looks really, really weird. When you start off toning an image, the best thing that you can always do is adjust your white balance. So if we take a look at this raw image, yeah, she looks funky. She's got this weird coloration. And this is where white balance can really help you inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic. So the first thing we're going to do with this is I'm going to come up to the color profiles that we see right here. And you notice that we don't have all the options. We have color and monochrome. So you'll see this in two different circumstances. One, if you're shooting a JPEG and you import in, you're not going to have all those options. And in this case, because it's a DNG and it's probably been converted, it doesn't have the options. Also, if you have an older camera, like from a while ago, it might not have all the color profile options. But in this case, we're just going to leave it in color. And we're going to come over here to auto and hit auto. And you can see it did okay, but it made her sort of magenta, which is not what we want. So we're going to just manually adjust this. I'm going to slide this green around to try to get it more accurate. It's not perfect. Still magenta. And this is looking better, but it's not looking great. And this is where we can start to use things like the color mixer, but this is something we're going to take a look at in another tutorial video. This image, we have adjusted that area and we've got it about as close as we can get it with what's available at this point. The next step that we're going to have here, it's a little bit dark, so we can brighten our image up just a teeny bit. It's a little bit flat, I understand that, but we're just going to go ahead and leave that. Now, down here under presence, we have texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. If you are only adjusting an image in Lightroom Classic, it's fine to make those adjustments. However, if you're going to tone eventually in Adobe Photoshop, I would suggest that you do not usually adjust those at this point because we can do that in Photoshop and you'll learn down the road that it just makes more sense to do them there. But texture is just going to increase the sharpness or texture of an image, which is usually something you don't want to do until after you've sized it. Clarity is increasing the contrast of your midtones. Dehaze is kind of weird. And so that's for kind of removing fog or haze in an image. And if we lower it, you can see it's getting hazier. Essentially, it's increasing the contrast of the image and it's trying to remove that. So not something that I like to do in the beginning. The next thing that we have is vibrance. So vibrance increases your subtle colors in your image. It's not really affecting as much the brighter colors. It's taking the subtle colors and either increasing or decreasing the vibrance of those softer colors. So right here in this jacket where we have sort of subtle colors, if I wanted to increase them, I could slide this. You can see it's still affecting this area here, but it's affecting these subtle values more. So that's what vibrance does. Saturation is just basically increasing the saturation of the image or decreasing the saturation of the image, depending on what you want to do. So I don't really use the presence options inside of Lightroom because I'm going to be moving on to Adobe Photoshop. But if you're not going to be using them, yeah, go ahead and use them. So just like anything I said before, if I want to reset everything, I hold Option and I can come in here and reset the tone and reset the presence so that we are back in the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and actually increase the highlights a little bit and the exposure on this image. And I could actually increase the contrast a little bit. So that seems like a pretty good starting point. And we're not ruining or adjusting any area in the image. So if you take a look at the basic panel, you're going to see there's a whole bunch of other options that we have. These are options that we're going to take a look at in another video. I want to do this one step at a time. It's very important that as you're learning the program, that you learn an aspect of it, then move on to the next step. I know that's not the fun way, but that's the better way to understand the program. So the best option for anybody is to get a series of images that you like, and then come in here and just make some basic white balance and tonal adjustments so you get used to moving the sliders, resetting the sliders, and understand how the program works. So a lot of people are now going to ask me, well, once I've done this, where is the save? So if we come up here and we go File, you'll notice there isn't a save. When you work inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic, as you move those adjustments, it automatically saves. And it's usually saving it either to the LR data file or to an XML, which we will get into later. But you don't have to do anything. So next time that you open up Lightroom, you're going to see all the adjustments and changes that you made because they get automatically saved. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. Don't forget to subscribe and have an absolutely wonderful day.